President Buhari, keen on fostering excellence across board, confers Order of Merit awards to deserving Nigerians.
The Nigerian National Order of Merit Award is one of the enduring national legacies that are held in high regard.
Senate works on comprehensive firearms control as House of Reps seeks support for vaccine research in Nigeria.
Vice President Oshibajo calls for the centrality and protection of the electorate in law, democracy, and the electoral process.
It is scholarship that reinforces and helps our courts to clarify their own thoughts and clarify their own reasoning.
And on Good Morning Nigeria today, we shall discuss the resurgence of undemocratic governments in Africa.
Well, there comes a time silence becomes dishonesty when the ruling intentions of personal existence are not in accord with the permanent assault on the most commonplace values. French writer Frantz Fanon captured his disapproval to despair, harassment, and other untoward hardship to colonialism in his published piece, The Wretched of the Earth.
Kirian, why that position from Fanon is laden with other values, we can say that such disapproval is what is coming on with the growing resurgence of undemocratic governments across Africa.
For a continent steeped in unsavory tastes of economic and political underperformance, poverty, corruption, and other declining strength to uphold living values, the trend to addressing the discontent is generating other aberrations, such as coup d'etats and other illegal takeovers of government in Africa.
Now, the worrisome development has seen the continent witness in the past 18 months, since with military leaders toppling the governments of Mali, Chad, Guinea, Sudan, Burkina Faso, and most recently, the attempt in Guinea-Bissau. Now, all are due to, according to the plotters, displeasure on behalf of the people.
And while the beleaguered regions of the continent seek true liberalization or liberation, yes, of course, liberation from the many grips of uncertainties to better the lot and the lives of the people, are these peaceful military seizures and unconstitutional coup the roads to true emancipation? What guarantees right uprising by the people for the people?
Now, talk is rife that the resurgence of coups could be an alarm, as it were, to the region's other civilian leaders. But how exactly should the issues that set the stage for takeovers be attended to democratically? And how do we stem the tide of what is gradually termed the epidemic of coups on the continent? Kirian, of course, we have also seen reactions from very important international institutions. ECOWAS, for instance, had outlawed undemocratic governance as part of the pillars of ensuring that the sub-region continues to grow. And in recent times, we have seen the ostracization of the leaders of countries where coups have taken place.
Well, the truth, Kingsley, is the fact that African leaders are part of the problem because nobody is, approving of coup d'etats in any part of the world. But when it comes to governance, that's what is exactly lacking on the African continent. And for the uniformed men and women to say, look, let's take over the government is a lesson, to some leaders, especially the sit-tight leaders who have in Africa. Some have ruled for over 30 years, they are still in power. And even though some of them who are up to 80 years are still campaigning, to return again in another time.
All right, Kirian, but what we have seen is that the coups have taken place in countries where you don't have sit-tight leaders, as it were, in recent months. And the African Union has also weighed in on this, that it's just concluded the 33rd ordinary session of heads of state and government. Well, that's our focus on Good Morning Nigeria today, as we take a look at the resurgence of undemocratic governments in Africa. Welcome to the program. I'm Kingsley Osadolo.
And I am Kirian Umayo. We're glad to have you join us this morning on this edition of Good Morning Nigeria. And we're live on the network service of the NTA. We're going to be bringing you, as always, the complimentary segments that will form part of today's package. Now, let's join Musbao Danwahab with the morning news highlights. Good morning, Musbao.
Very good morning, Kirian and Kingsley. Here is the news. President Muhammadu Buhari says Nigeria is keen on fostering excellence across board and will continue to celebrate those who contributed their quota to the difficult task of getting her on the top bracket of outstanding nations. This was at the conferment of the 2020 and 2021 Nigerian National Order of Merit Awards to the 7 citizens of the country.
The Nigerian National Order.
Nigeria is now in the 22nd unbroken year as a democracy with a series of peaceful transition to power. Vice President Professor Yemi Osinbajo says the right of the electorate is central to democracy and that must be protected by electoral laws and judicial interpretations in electoral cases. The Vice President spoke at the 53rd Conference of the National Association of Law Teachers with the theme Law, Democracy and the Electoral Process.
It is scholarship that reinforces and helps our courts to clarify their own thoughts and clarify their own reasoning. Where there is no alternative view coming from anywhere, where scholarship is silent, then we cannot blame the direction in which our legal institution is going.
First Lady of Nigeria, Aisha Muhammadu Buhari, has reaffirmed her determination to continue to advocate for more support to be accorded to the Africa First Lady Peace Mission towards enhancing the lives of women and children of the African continents. The First Lady stated this when she received the Vice President of the ECOWAS Commission, Finda Koroma, who paid a courtesy call on her. The discussion between the First Ladies and the Vice President of the ECOWAS centered on the possible collaboration between the Africa First Ladies Peace Mission and the ECOWAS for the benefit of women, youth and children from across the continents.
Finda Koroma, the Vice President of ECOWAS, and we would like to seek for ECOWAS support of Africa First Ladies Peace Mission to play a role in peace building and women's participation in politics in Africa.
I came here to congratulate my sister warmly, Her Excellency Aisha Buhari, on her recent confirmation, actually, as President of the African First Ladies Peace Mission. As you know, ECOWAS predicates itself on peace building, on peace and security. And we believe that First Ladies really are champions for change and they have a vital role to play in peace building.
The Senate is making efforts to provide legal framework for a comprehensive system of firearms control and to provide for matters connected therewith. The bill intends to regulate movement of arms and ammunition, among other things.
Establish a comprehensive system of firearms control and to provide for matters connected there with 2022 SACA reading taking. And the bill is referred to the Committee on Judiciary, Human Rights and Legal Matters to report back within 4 weeks.
And the House of Representatives is working on a legislation to facilitate the establishment of a Center for Vaccine Research and Development in Nigeria. The bill, to that effect, passed a second reading during Tuesday's plenary.
It will offer Nigerians and Nigeria a very special opportunity where vaccine can be studied in a research center in relation to our peculiarities. There are some vaccines that you acquire from Western world, you take it for 2 years, you will never have typhoid. Our people need to do that, even on issue of malaria.
Away from the National Assembly, Nigeria is developing a national roadmap for the management of response to criminal or unauthorized acts contravening regulatory control. Director General, Nigerian Nuclear Regulatory Authority, Yao Idris, serves at a workshop for the management of atomic energy.
This caused the need to develop national capabilities to respond to criminal and unauthorized acts involving nuclear and radioactive materials.
The federal government has been asked to put a hold on the creation of new parastatals, agencies and commissions to reduce cost of governance in the country. This forms part of recommendations of the reports of 2 review committees on restructuring and rationalization of federal government's parastatals, agencies and commissions submitted to Secretary to the Government of the Federation, Boss Mustafa, in Abuja.
New federal parastatals, agencies and commission. B, to direct the National Salaries, Income and Wages Commission to adhere strictly to the act establishing it and henceforth desist from approving salaries.
And for some days now, Nigerians have been treated to stories of a purported failure of the National Identity Management Commission, NIMS's verification portal. The development is reported to have affected some public services requiring the National Identity Number NIN.
Ongoing, people will also get their own NIN. They can also check their NIN using the *346# hash. They can also use the mobile service and they can also use the tokenizations for verification service.
And that's a bit of the news on Good Morning Nigeria. The program will continue in just a moment with Kingsley and Kirian. Stay with us.
The 157-kilometer Lagos-Ibadan Railway is the first double-track standard gauge railway to be built in West Africa. The Mobolaji Johnson train station is a masterpiece, an infrastructure that is gradually becoming an iconic building in Lagos State. The modern facilities put the station on a world map of train stations. Likewise, other new train stations across the country built to world-class standards. The train and its convenience is indeed an admirable effort, with commendations from Nigerians.
This is a station that we have to commend the federal government for putting a beautiful face, empowering us in Lagos State, not only in economic and political arena.
I can say that I'm really impressed with the infrastructures in place. Kudos to the Minister of Transportations. Kudos to the federal government.
Truly, good things are coming out of Nigeria, and the federal government is deserving of all the applause.
Everybody knows the secret to good cooking is that special ingredient. The mothers know it, but does this new generation know it? Let's find out. Mothers, daughters, are you ready? Yes! Let the cooking begin.
Erisco tomato paste. Now we get home, now we get love, now we get children. With a spice the world, with a meal so great and so healthy. You know we've got your back. Oh, with Erisco, Ridico, Nagico.
Ladies and gentlemen, food is ready.
Food of love. Tomato paste. Good food for the body. Yum yum for the body.
Erisco Richico and Nagico tomato paste is made by Erisco Foods Limited, feeding Africans with healthy foods.
The counsel of our fathers.
I will urge and advise our younger generation to use talent and brain to sort out problems, not arms.
Nigerian youths, let's build our nation together.
big day ahead.
New Ovaltine 3-in-1. Smart choice for smart kids.
The counsel of our fathers.
I believe we have fought one civil war too many in this country. So those who experience it will run away from it.
Nigerian youths, let's build our nation together.
Contemporary times require practical skills to remain competitive and relevant in your organization. Therefore, take advantage of NTA TV College Short Proficiency courses to sharpen your professional skills. Computer Appreciation for Media Practitioners. Date 21st February to 28th February 2022. 1 week. English Grammar and Pronunciation for Broadcasters. Date 1st March to 25th March. 4 weeks. Administrative Principles, Processes and Practices. Date 11th March to 31st March 2022. 4 weeks. Modern Trends in Broadcast Media Marketing. Date 14th March to 13th April 2022. 4 weeks. Basic Broadcast Accounting and Auditing. Date 4th April to 19th April 2022. 2 weeks. The course fee for the 1 week course is 100,000 naira per participant. The fee for the 2 week course is 150,000 naira, while the course fee for the 4 week course is 180,000 naira only, accommodation inclusive. The venue for all courses is the serene and secure environment of NTA TV College, near Old Government House, Rayfield, Jos. For more inquiries, please call 0803-314-4383 or 0806-980-9807. NTA TV College, training you to be the best you want to be.
All right, you are still watching Good Morning Nigeria and the network service of NTA. Now let's go business. Development experts have joined the workforce to master the dynamics of entrepreneurship to achieve gainful employment. Let's now join Alika Opanachi Arwa for the details.
With micro, small and medium enterprises constituting the larger chunk of the workforce, development experts have emphasized that taking solace in entrepreneurship will complement the gains of MSMEs, which has engaged over 60 million Nigerians. Civil servants have equally been employed to imbibe the culture as they prepare for post-retirement life.
Entrepreneurs have facilitated the continued evolution of the Nigerian economy from times when goods were bartered to today when MSMEs employ as much as 60 million people and contribute about 48% of the Nigerian GDP. Our mandate at the Abuja Enterprise Agency is geared towards accelerating business development in the FCT through designing and implementing projects, programs, and activities that will stimulate business growth, thereby creating employment and reducing the raving poverty in our country.
Different agencies of government, even Federal Capital Territory Administration and the Abuja Enterprise Agency have been facilitating programs to achieve this quest. With business news, Alika Opanachi Arwa.
Thank you, Alika, for the business package. Next on our program is a review of some of the papers we have this morning.
All right, Bayo Tebi is here with us as always. Bayo, good morning and welcome.
Thank you, Kirian. Good morning. Good morning, Kinsley.
Right, Bayo,
good
good
morning,
to see you.
Nigeria.
Okay, we have 3 papers here.
That's right.
Okay.
Leadership, Nigerian pilot, and the nation. Let's take off with the Nigerian pilot, and its lead story is a matter that has been in the news, and that's adulterated fuel. That is the headline of its lead story, and as always, the headline has an exclamation mark. Adulterated fuel and a number of riders. Marketers speak on fuel scarcity, say queues will persist until depots restock, and blame current scarcity on contaminated fuel supplied to some parts of the country. Insists scarcity will persist in Lagos and others until, that's another rider there coming from the first one. As Ipman warns against panic buying, says fuel will be available soon. And the photograph on this front page shows a long queue opposite the NNPC towers in Abuja. And other headlines from the front page of the paper, this time below the name flag, anti-grazing law will plunge state into crisis. Bietiala warns plateau government. That's on page 9. PDP accuses Emefiele of politicizing CBN. And then back again to stories below the lead. It said 2023, Oshibajo denies plan to declare presidential ambition. That's page 5. 5 billion naira loot. Ex-JAMB registrar Ojerinde begs for plea bargain with ICPC. Terrorists kill 13 persons, kidnap village head in Katsina. Public misconduct. CCT boss, that is Code of Conduct Tribunal boss, Umar, to no fate. April 26th. JAMB postpones 2022-23 UTME direct entry registration to February 19th. Senate approves bill for 6 new law schools after clash with NBA. Stop your accusations against judiciary. Supreme Court wants AGF. Kieran.
All right, now let's turn to Leadership newspaper. PMB confers National Merit Awards on 3 scholars on page 8. Court dismisses a suit against them for a governor's defection to APC on page 12. We're on Leadership newspaper. I hope you can get that now right. Nigeria's problems have defied cosmetic solutions. That's IBB. The story is on page 4. You may recall the SAP of those days, that also defied all known and unknown economic, solutions. All right, ASU declares for APC National Chairman, page 6. Orosanye report, committee suspends creation of agencies on page 7. You can't turn us to slaves, ASU tells federal government. Okay, now the next is the Nation newspaper. The Nation newspaper, above the name flag of the Nation newspaper, Court affirms Metawale as Zamfara governor on page 3. Senate okays 6 additional law school campuses, as on page 5. APC releases templates to resolve Kano crisis. South governors resolute on power shift, says Akeredolu, as on page 5. Charges dropped against hotelier, others over OAU student death, as on page 3. NNPC subsidiary links scarcity to withdrawal of toxic petrol. Shortage will continue, according to marketers. Now, the lead story on the Nation: pressure on Buhari to reject reworked electoral bill. Eyebrow on provision that ministers should resign to contest for office. INEC to get list of candidates by August 8. All that on page 5. 10 killed, village head abducted. That's at the bottom of the paper. 10 killed, village head abducted in Katsina, on page 3. Also on page 3, Kagara residents pay 70 million ransom. Bayo.
Thank you, Kire. Let's start with the topic of the Nation now. The Nigerian Midstream and Upstream Regulatory Agency has clarified the causative factor of the queues that we're witnessing around filling stations. It says that methanol, a content of as an additive to premium motor spirit, has been found to be above specification. The stream that has been identified has been withdrawn from the chain of circulation. Nevertheless, the NNPC has been advised to increase supply of unadulterated petroleum to fill in for the shortfall. This clarifies the way for speculation that the growing queue is a ploy to reintroduce subsidy.
Reintroduce or to remove?
To remove subsidy.
Yes.
The Nigerian Tribune reports scarcity in Lagos, Ogun, and Oyo State, where queues have become very prevalent. An independent marketer told the Nigerian Tribune that following complaints from motorists about the fuel quality, he had no choice but to shut his station so as to stop people from buying fuel that could damage their cars. He says this was only a safety measure and not hoarding, as people are speculating that filling stations are hoarding petrol. It was, however, observed that in spite of the few stations selling petrol, the pump price still remained 162 naira 50 kobo and 165 naira, the range that is still subsisting. The questions are, who approved this petrol that was imported as fit for circulation? Because there should be a quality control agent who certify the petrol before they are accepted into the country.
Who are the importers? Who are the importers? It's not NNPC that imports fuel right now. So why wouldn't someone know the right fuel to import and circulate? As a matter of fact, how many states can you find this adulterated? How do we now know the number of states that have, of course, received the supply of this adulterated fuel? Nobody knows. No,
so from all indications, they've identified southwest part of the country and the middle part of the country. So the moment they notice it, they recalled all the tankers that were going with that type of fuel and notified those other stations to shut down.
If you recall yesterday on this program, we were talking about fuel scarcity and the resurgence of queues at filling stations. And I did say that on Monday, I drove on the airport road, and a number of filling stations were closed, and only probably a couple, were selling fuel. And the question was, what is happening? We were calling on the appropriate agency, that's to say the midstream and downstream regulatory authority, to check those filling stations, whether they had stock and whether they were hoarding. Which also leads us to another point. Today is Wednesday. It was not until yesterday that there was an official explanation of what is happening. And you have to ask yourself, why would it take that long for members of the public to be informed about a critical public product, such as fuel? There were a number of videos circulating on social media, and some ignorant persons were lampooning those who had bought the fuel without the right specification, had their vehicles damaged or their generators damaged, and they said, look, what is going on? And nobody knew. So there was a presumption that, look, there will be fuel scarcity, and then the usual hawkers were already by the roadside. Now, out of panic, people were patronizing those persons. You were not sure what you were buying from the roadside hawker, or what you were even buying from the approved dealers who were supplied. So the issue is, why did it take this long for the members of the public to be informed and advised as to what is happening? So right now, you have to ask yourself your question, where should you go to purchase fuel?
In fact, yesterday, at the 11 junction, where people, were even patronizing the hawkers. So I asked one of the hawkers to say, look, how do you determine that this fuel, is the authentic one? He just dipped his hand into the into the can and splashed it on the tire of the vehicle, and it dries up immediately. So you say, Oga, if it didn't dry, then there's something in the fuel. So that's their own method of determining the adulterated fuel. That's the hawkers themselves.
Hawkers on the street?
Yes, they just dip their hand and splash it on the tire.
But and, you didn't ask them where they usually get their petrol.
Well, we have two filling stations in that area, so they got it from them, right? They got it from them. What they usually do is to use cars or keke napep, fill in the tank and just siphon it, into the jerry cans. That's what they usually do.
And usually, what happens in our climate, and which is unfortunate, at the end of the day, those whose vehicles or power generators have been affected by this fuel without the right specification will just be left to lick their own wounds.
Oh, good.
Which is wrong, ordinarily, because somebody ought to...
there should be consequences.
There should be consequences. Who imported this fuel without the right specification. And
who clarified
who
it for distribution?
Who cleared it? I mean, there should be inspection.
Of course.
To say that, look, this
Standard
one is
Organization of Nigeria, quality control.
Well, I don't know whoever is supposed to do it. What happened?
Consequences of our inability to refine our own fuel. These are the consequences, because if that fuel is refined locally, of course, if any quantum of our fuel is adulterated, we'll easily find out, before it gets circulated.
And you recall, if you remember that we had a similar instance of adulterated fuel in this country in 1998. That fuel was, if you were 1 mile away, that fuel was smelling. A number of mechanics died, when they were trying to maintain vehicles, because a number of engines got knocked, sucking out fuel from carburetor and so on and so forth. My vehicle was affected at that time, in 1998. If you were in Lagos, Lagos was stinking of that fuel, and I think in different parts of the country. So why would we be going through this kind of routine thing? They said, oh, it was adulterated fuel. Oh, they are trying to recall it was during the military regime. And, left, right, and center, you were allowed to do whatever you liked. And, of course, you paid out of your pocket for whatever damages, you suffered.
The Senate yesterday passed the bill. We now have Nigerian law schools 6 in 6 geopolitical zones. This is approved after consideration of the report of the Judiciary, Human Rights and Legal report that was presented to Senate at plenary. Currently, we now have 7 law schools. With the approval of these 6, it will bring the total to 13 law schools in Nigeria. If you add the one in the FCT, it becomes 14. The distribution shows that the Plateau and Kaba are the only 2 that have in North Central. Yola and Maiduguri are to have 1 each in the Northeast. In Northwest, you have Kano and Arugungu who have law schools, while in Southeast, it will be at Enugu and Okija. Yenegua and Port Harcourt have the ones for the law school for the South, while the Southwest has 1 in Lagos and another is to be at Ilawe. The Senate says the creation is a legislative intervention to address the empowerment, the exponential increase in graduating law students, as well as those from abroad. And also...
I'm sorry to interject. Yes. We had discussed this sometime last year. It is not yet a law, it is a bill passed by the Senate. And we'll see what happens when the bill also gets passed by the House of Reps, and then it goes to Mr. President for his accent or otherwise. And my opinion last year, which remains the same, is that if the bill does get to the president should withhold his accent. It's as simple as that. The chairman of the Council of Legal Education, that's Emeka Ngige, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, is complaining about the underfunding of the existing law schools. And then you are creating additional law schools. What is the purpose? To create additional law schools for what purpose? How many law graduates do you have each year? And what is supposed to be the population of each of the campuses, existing campuses? 7 of them.
We politicize every other thing in this country. It's just for you to be cited in the geopolitical zone. Does it really matter? Must you have law schools everywhere in the country?
Absolutely.
Well, what is necessary is to have a quality law schools, not just any kind of law school. If the existing ones are underfunded, what will happen to 6 more coming on board? So it's unbecoming.
You can argue, once again, I apologize. You can argue that, okay, population is growing, which was the rationale. When we went to the law school, there was only 1 law school in the country, like Victoria Island in Lagos. So you have had, after that, they then created the law school here in Abuja, which of course is now the center. And then later they created additional ones. Why don't you seek to expand the facilities for the existing law schools, rather than creating mushroom law schools all over the place?
All right, pressure on Buhari to reject the revoked electoral bill. That ministers and commissioners should resign before they seek for political office.
The first story that came was that CSO had given President Buhari 1 week to sign the bill, and that 1 week lapsed yesterday, and so what? The law allows 30 days for that law to be signed. There are several considerations that the president has. All these are in the ambit of speculation. The electoral bill is very important so that INEC can get properly prepared for the 2023 elections. And it can now begin to see a clear roadmap for it to go about the activities. But be that as it may, let it wait and go through the process.
Well, that's fine. That aspect of the bill is something that, again, I had drawn attention to. If you require those in the executive branch to resign their positions while seeking elective offices, why is it that those who are, say, in the legislative branch do not also vacate their seats to seek re-election? Baya Toby, thanks a lot for being around. We'll see you again tomorrow. All right, this is Good Morning Nigeria, and we're live on NTA's network service. We're taking a short break now. When we return, we'll be dealing with the epidemic of undemocratic governments in Africa, more especially West Africa.
There's a drop of goodness in everyone. Share goodness with someone today.
Malta Guinness. Enjoy a world of good.
The Nigerian aviation sector is rapidly growing with the construction of new international airport terminals in several regions of the country. The new Murtala Mohammed International Airport has an estimated passenger increase of 30 million annually and 15 million for Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport, Abuja. Malam Aminu Kano International Airport is also expected to open new frontiers for the region with more travel capacity for the annual Hajj, while the new Akanu Ibiam International Airport, Enugu, avails more business opportunities connecting the industrial cities in the region to the world. These new terminals beat world-class standards with enabling infrastructure that aid air travel, tourism, and the eventual growth of the country's GDP.
Open up commerce and, of course, link us to international societies.
People from international community will come here to do business, and then that will bring in more revenue to the state.
Now, distances can be seamlessly covered as Nigeria keeps raising its bar to suit global infrastructure standards.
The counsel of our fathers.
My advice to these young people is please do not take us back to those harrowing days. You probably do not know what it is.
Nigerian youths, let's build our nation together.
COVID-19, that is the black swan of the century, has actually hit the whole world very hard, even the strongest of economies, and Nigeria was not spared. But due to the proactive stance and steps that the president has taken, we've been able to come out quickly. The president has consistently said we must invest in infrastructure. Even as we're investing in human capital, that we must invest in infrastructure. Because at the end of the day, that is what will bring about a sustainable economic growth. So the president has given us our directive. He has said you must make sure you pay salaries and pay pensions, but you also make sure that the critical projects of roads, railway, airports, bridges, major infrastructure that are meant to drive the growth of the economy, that we consistently invest in them, even if we have to continue to borrow to do so.
This message is from the Federal Ministry of Information and Culture.
Well, the housing solution we have developed is a multifaceted one. First, we have tried to lead a program to build what we think will be an acceptable and hopefully affordable housing type based on surveys we did in 2015-2016 and construction that started in 2017. And that's going on in 24 states as the National Housing Program.
This message is from the Federal Ministry of Information and Culture.
All right, now as a prompt for our conversation this morning, let's take a background report put together by Abdulsalam Jubrain.
On the 1st of February 2022, armed men surrounded the government palace where President Umaru Sissoco Embalo of Guinea-Bissau and other top government officials were attending a government meeting. There were several reports of gunfire and an assassination attempt linked to the illegal drugs trade. By the time the dust settled, however, it was revealed that the incident was a failed coup attempt. Over the past 18 months, there have been 7 coups and coup attempts in African nations, in Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea, Mali, and Sudan. Some military leaders succeeded in seizing power, while in Niger, and most recently in Guinea-Bissau, the military failed to seize power. It would be recalled that the current wave of coups began in August 2020, after former Malian President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta was arrested at gunpoint by military forces. Some experts maintain that the recent series of coups on the continent share some commonalities, such as political and economic instability and weak democratic institutions. In addition to this, others have attributed the frequent coups to external forces, stressing that the ghost of the Cold War still hovers on the continent. Following the failed coup in Guinea-Bissau, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, convened to discuss the unrest, which ECOWAS chair Nana Akufo-Addo described as contagious and a threat to the entire region. The African Union, on its part, decried the wave of unconstitutional changes of government at its recent summit and has suspended Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, and Sudan from the continental body. However, some experts have also criticized the AU and regional bodies, emphasizing they are not doing enough to curtail the widespread coups the continent is currently witnessing. Why is Africa currently witnessing a resurgence of coups? Beyond condemnation and suspensions, what more should the AU and regional bodies do towards forestalling coups in Africa? These and more guests on the program will be speaking to shortly.
Thank you very much, Abdulsalam Jubrail, for that background. We have joining us in our studios to discuss this subject matter Ambassador Usman Sarki is currently directing staff at NIPS in Jos, or that's Kuru, near Jos in Plateau State. Ambassador Sarki had also previously been Nigeria's deputy permanent representative to the United Nations. Ambassador Sarki, pleasure to have you. Good morning.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Also here with us in the studios, we'd like to welcome Honorable Nkoyo Toyo. She's Nigeria's former ambassador to Ethiopia and also a former member of the House of Representatives.
Thank you very much.
All right, and also with us this morning on the program is Ambassador Dauda Danladi, former Nigerian High Commissioner to Pakistan. It's a good morning and welcome to the program.
Kirian, it looks like Ambassador Danladi is not being connected to us just yet, so we'll take the other guest.
Okay, now let's also introduce Paul Ejime, International Affairs Analyst, who is seated with us here in the studio. Thank you, Paul, for being here this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, and I hope we'll have our guest in Lagos ready, Professor Hossa Osaye, the Director General, Nigerian Institute for International Affairs. And good morning and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
All right. Once again, our pleasure to have all our guests just here with us, except Ambassador Danladi. As we said, once we get a connection, then we'll also bring him into the conversation. Now, we have seen in a year and a half the resurgence of undemocratic governments in Africa. And some would argue that what we are seeing in coups are just symptoms. What could be the disease? Ambassador Sarki.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It is clearly a very disconcerting development, particularly in our region, to see the spate of coup d'etat taking place, changing governments unconstitutionally. They are symptoms of a disease, and that disease is structural in terms of the disrespect for constitutional order and arrangements in our countries. The morality of law is being discarded. Law is no longer sacrosanct in our region, particularly in those countries where fragility has been ingrained in their system since after the independence from colonial rule. So you find that the Constitution as an instrument to stabilize governance and structure the state has become a mere issue, a matter of expedience for some people, to use it and to discard it accordingly. So the military in those countries have become tools of interests to be used by interests in order to destabilize their country, undermine democracy, undermine rule of law, and replace the rule of law with military might. And this is what we are seeing. So it is incumbent upon all democratic forces in our region to raise their voices up and to act in order to denounce these activities that are tantamount to good order, to stability, to rule of law, and to constitutional order. It is very important that Nigeria's foreign policy now should be geared towards deterrence of military takeovers, unconstitutional takeover of government, as established and clearly enunciated in protocols and charters of ECOWAS and the African Union. So the symptoms that you have said is given rise to by the disease of greed for power and greed for material wealth and control over people in our region. We have to come out very clearly to state it. Why should anybody at this day, in this day and age, change government forcefully for just mere speculative reasons about incapacity of the government without demonstrating that incapacity? If there is incapacity of government, allow the electorate, the people who elected that government to come to power, to decide that the government is incapacitated for one reason or the other, and then change it through established democratic constitutional means, and not through the barrel of the gun. So I agree with you, sir, that this is a symptom of deep-rooted disease in our region that must be cured collectively by governments in our region.
Yes, and as we get on the program, we'll be able to know the kind of therapy that could be applied to be able to take care of the disease. Now, Paul Ejime, this disease appears to be very contagious, especially in West African sub-region. What could be the cause of this?
Thank you. I think the ambassador has actually hinted on that it is the erosion of the democratic gains that our region had, notched up over the past 20 years. And then the fact that, for instance, 30 or 20 years ago, remember we had governments in the bush or forest and others in the city. I hope we are not going back there. So how come we now, after gaining, instead of consolidating, what is happening is that they are now pulling down those structures of democracy. He hinted at it, corruption is one of them, greed is one of them, avarice, and then the lust for power, political ambition of individuals. And then there are, there's also an element of external interference when you remember when we talk about the Francophone countries where this thing is happening. But this is not to say that this Malay respects any phone, be it Anglophone, Francophone, or Lusophone. What is there is that there is deficiency, there is leadership lacuna. The leaders are not, in fact, some people call them rulers, because they are no longer. You wonder if this were the type of the type of leaders that Africa had during the colonial power, whether these leaders will be able to extricate Africa, whether they will be able to liberate Africa. They are not showing that capacity. They are not showing the passion of Pan-Africanism. They are not showing patriotism. You find people looting their countries and then warehousing these loots in foreign countries. And because these foreign capitals, these powers, they know where the weakness of these leaders, they now come at them and they become, like blackmail. So they cannot lift, when these leaders, outside forces now tell them, they are now dictating to them. You find ECOWAS, for instance, when, for instance, France is complaining about the fact that Mali is employing or recruiting some military forces from Russia. ECOWAS is also joining in condemning that. When what is happening is the problem of insecurity. There is hunger and anger in Africa because of the fact that the leaders have become rulers. They are now catering to themselves and not the people. So it is part of the fact that Africa should reassert its independence. And then let Africans, their leaders, let's begin with the recruitment process. Those that are elected. I think it behoves of the electorate now to look at examine the credentials of those they are putting, electing. Don't compromise by selling your vote. Make sure that you are voting people not because of they are throwing money at you or because of influence, but those who can deliver. From there, you can now demand accountability. If this happens, I think we'll be consolidating on democracy instead of pulling down the pillars.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul Ejime, for your opening comments. Let's go over to our Lagos Network studios, where we earlier introduced Professor Egosa Osaga, who is Director General of NIA, also there on Victoria Land in Lagos. Professor Osaga is a professor of political science, formerly at the University of Ibadan. He was also Vice Chancellor of Igbinedion University for many years. Professor Osaga, what's your diagnosis of the disease afflicting mostly West Africa today, the resurgence of unconstitutional takeover of governments?
I thank you very much. First, it's not a West African problem. It's, as the ambassador said, it's a structural problem that goes very deep, to the very foundations of statehood and statecraft and all the things that have to do with governance on the continent. I think, you're right in saying that these are symptomatic, of perhaps things that are fundamentally wrong, and they are structural, in the sense that they are just, reminders of the fact that we have a lot of unresolved issues of contention over statehood, over governance, and especially over issues of accountability, over issues of representation, over issues of corruption, and so on. Now, I think that, you cannot graft democratic practices and institutions on structures that are basically unresolved and therefore fragile. What these things are saying is perhaps we need to have another look at the foundations, the makeup, the configuration of our states. How much consensus do we have on the viability of these states? How much consensus do we have on how to govern the states? How much consensus do we have on the legitimacy of the state? Now, democracy, by definition, seems to provide answers to these kinds of contentious issues. And the experience everywhere on a comparative basis is that democracy is able to do this. Democracy allows for the spaces that may have been submerged or suppressed in non-democratic regimes. It allows for those spaces to sprout, and therefore you can have an opening up of all of the forces, the inclusiveness, the diversity, of opinions, so they can all be brought to bear on these issues. Now, once this is going on, democracy is expected to grow, to deepen, and get to points of irreversibility, and then you can begin to talk about consolidation. But once you have triggers that are pulled by the kinds of unfortunate things we have seen in the Sahel, for instance, you have challenges, very serious challenges of perennial instability and violent extremism, the things that challenge further the fragility of the state and put question marks on the abilities of not just the state only now, but also of democratic structures to respond to the kinds of issues that are then thrown up. You expect these kinds of things. You think of it. How come, flashpoints of conflict, flashpoints of, say, terrorism, flashpoints of such great instability, then become also the flashpoints of governance instability? I think that it's something that we have to consider in a more fundamentally inclusive way. It's not just a West African problem. We have seen in Sudan, for instance, that there are those kinds of contentions. But the point is about the state. It's about its legitimacy, it's about its ownership, and the extent to which democracy can provide, avenues for resolving many of these historical and structural issues that continue to linger on with statehood in Africa.
All right. Thanks for that elaborate explanation. In fact, from the past speakers on this program, we have raised a number of, issues that, of course, militating against democratic principles in most of these countries that we've had coup d'etats. That goes to show that the coup plotters may have one or two reasons as to why they're struck. Well, we did not, it's an aberration, whichever way we look at it, but then there are perennial issues in those countries. Now, before I bring in Nkoyo Toyo, let's introduce Ambassador Dauda Danladi, former Nigerian High Commissioner to Pakistan. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
All right. Nkoyo Toyo, it does appear that in all of these countries where coups have taken place, the people tend to identify with the coup plotters. They troop out en masse and give support to the coup plotters. Does that encourage continuity with respect to more coups? People, military officers being encouraged to, take up arms and remove a democratically elected government in their states, considering, perennial issues coming from all aspects of governance, poor institutions, leadership deficiency, hunger and anger, according to a GMA. So does that encourage officers to take up arms against government?
Very much. Thank you. Thank you for bringing me on the program. I think I would start by saying that when a couple of structural, perennial, intractable problems come together, they become the basis for uncertainties, and they create those uncertainties within every country. And we have seen a situation where increasingly that the democratic systems that we have embodied over the years have not solved the problems of society. Increasingly, we're seeing growing population problems which are creating and putting a lot of emergency situations on many countries, climate change-led emergencies. We are seeing, like Professor Osage talked about, the situation in countries which are threatened by armed insurgents and things like that. It only goes to say that the emergency of the situation, the urgency of the situation, the complexities of the situation force people to begin to ask for change. And you even saw the impact of change on our country. The moment change comes, people want to see a rebirth of something different. Whether that in itself means that people are in itself providing a basis for the military takeover to happen and to exist and to gain some sort of credibility, is a whole different argument. I think it's also a question of taking every context differently, because the circumstances that drive that context are very, very peculiar to themselves. And I think in all of these conversations, as much as we look at what the military is doing, we must look more at where the nature of the democratic institutions themselves in those countries are doing. There are people who have commented that what we do by changing the constitution and extension and elongation of terms by certain leaders in the West African sub-region in particular is actually a coup in itself. And coups don't also have to be just military. Coups can be civilian coups. When a system gets up and says, I want to change what existed in order that I may continue to perpetrate myself in government, that in itself is a coup against the country. So what I'm saying, in effect, is that people are pushed by what they experience to react to these coups in a particular way. We've seen the popularity in Burkina Faso and Mali, and these are countries that are threatened by very, very dire conditions of insurgency, violence, and brutal murder of many of their citizens, displacements of many people. And it's only natural to expect that in those countries, the reactions and the responses of the people will be positive if they begin to feel that what existed before now is something that is not addressing their immediate needs. And this goes to the point you tried to make at the beginning of your comments, which is, are we also seeing the failure of democracies themselves to deliver on democratic dividends and provide the kind of answers which Egosa talks about? The very nature of democracy is that it opens spaces for people who have not hitherto been listened to or had their voices heard to come into the process. But when they have come into the process, it begins to also form and storm. Democracy allows for many spaces for people to speak up and to say the things which have not been said in the past. And in doing so, it raises the level and temperature of the conflicts within the system. And the fragility of the system is not a system that is able to manage that complexity. And that's when we begin to see the kinds of implosions that we are seeing within the system. I think it's important to also add that why we tend to make it look like a West African problem and an African problem is that these specific protocols, whether they be the ones for ECOWAS in 2001 or on good governance and democracy, or the ones at the African Union levels, are directly meant to be dealing with this very peculiar circumstance on the continent. It's very much something which this continent has seen in the past and continues now to see the resurgence of. So it's a very strongly embedded thing within the fragility of the state, as we know. The question of statehood, which Professor Sage talks about, how did our countries emerge as countries? These were countries that were partitioned without any reference to geography, commonalities, or anything of the people who inhabit the country. So the countries are themselves birthed into conflict, even from their very beginning, and they have been trying to manage the very complex natures of conflicts that have given birth to them.
Honorable Nkoyo, thank you very much there also for your opening comments. Let's bring in our Ambassador Danladi into the conversation. Ambassador Danladi, I mean, away from the comments by the other guests, and still, of course, along the lines of the comments that they have made, is it possible for us to indicate whether, again, this is a peculiar West African affliction? And I have my reasons for posing this question. Other than, say, the Sudan and Chad, which are geographically not part of West Africa, and perhaps with the exception of the DRC, that's Democratic Republic of Congo, and Burundi in the Great Lakes region, you don't have this kind of problem elsewhere on the African continent. It is in West Africa that you will find the many examples recently of unconstitutional change of government. In Southern Africa, since 1986, when Leboa Jonathan was overthrown in Lesotho, you haven't had any such thing. There are structural issues, and there were structural issues in Mozambique. You have structural issues also in Zambia, and yet we have not had unconstitutional change of government. So is this a peculiar West African affliction so that we know what kind of scalpel to bring to cure or treat this disease?
Well, thank you. I think possibly we may have to go back to history. If you recall that following the wave of independence in the 1960s, African heads of government gathered in Addis Ababa in 1963 precisely, and they had a vision. They made a very powerful pronouncements led by great leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, like Julius Nyerere, like Zik, the Zik of Africa. And the pronouncement was that they will use the mandate of independence to develop Africa. They will use the mandate of independence to rid their people of ignorance, disease, and poverty. They also made an observation that, look, even though they inherited artificial boundaries, they will respect the sovereignty of these boundaries, because to readjust these boundaries will lead Africa into perpetual conflict. They also made an observation that they will have to be mindful that the colonialists would not relinquish their stronghold on the African continent. Subsequently, what followed was a wave of coups. If you remember, Patrice Lumumba was killed barely 9 months after independence. Hamani Dori of Niger. We lost people like Felix Malum of Chad. Nkrumah was deposed. Even in Africa, in Nigeria, the Zik government, Tafawa Balewa Sadona, they were removed in office. So it was a kind of really external influence and interference which have introduced coups, and gradually we had the guerrilla movements. So what is happening today in the ECOWAS region is just a repetition. It's just history is repeating itself. And unless the ECOWAS and the African Union adopt a new strategy for addressing some of the challenges, we will continue to see a resurgence of coups, not only in the West African region, but on the African continent. It is a vicious cycle, because when the military comes in, they suspend the constitution, the rule of law, of course, is suspended. Gradually, anarchy is introduced through dictatorship, which will lead to civil strife, and may even lead to civil wars. We hope that it will not be a vicious cycle of what has been happening in the 60s that we are witnessing today.
Well, just as he rightly said, that it appears to be history repeating itself, especially in our own sub-region. Ambassador Usman Stariki, he talked about external influence of the colonial masters. How much has that contributed to today's coup that we're having in Africa? Yes, in Mali's own coup, already the government of that country has fallen out with their former colonial masters one way or another, but then they may be representing perhaps another interest that the colonial masters did not go down well with the colonial masters. So how much of a role has this external forces played, in ensuring, in making these coups successful in the West African sub-region?
Thank you very much. I think, it will be very perilous for us to discountenance external involvement. There are huge, considerable interests in controlling Africa's resources. Today, there is a very big battle, ideological and even material battle going on between China and the Western countries over the control of Africa's resources, over influence. You remember immediately Donald Trump came into office in America. His national security advisor and his Secretary of State both indicated in speeches that their Africa policy will react to the growing influence of China and Russia in Africa. And that was a clear statement that they will not allow those two powers to come and establish their influence in Africa over and above the interests of the United States. And this posture of the former colonial powers and other powers, external powers in Africa, has continued. The most important issue regarding Africa is the control of the wealth of the continent. Whoever controls the state machinery, the state power, the government, is in a position to come to terms, to agreements with external forces in terms of how to manage and control the economy of the continent. The greatest failure of African countries, or many of our countries, from independence till now, is the efficient and effective management of the economy to favor the people, the populations of those countries. So our economies are still the appendages of the economies of the metropolitan countries. So the class character of the rulers, like Mr. Ajima said, of the rulers in Africa, explains the dichotomy, the shortcomings that we're experiencing in the management of the state apparatus in our countries. 2 or 3 years ago, when Guinea came into the limelight because of these problems, we learned of a Swiss French national who came to buy an entire hill that is composed of iron, very precious, high-quality iron ore, for about $450 million. And allegedly, that person bribed a former highly placed person, gave them about $10 million. And subsequent to the attainment of rights to that mine, that person sold the rights to a Brazilian company, we were told, for $1 billion. And that became a huge scandal in Switzerland and France. Surprisingly, we in Africa and Guinea, we were just mere spectators in this drama. There was no prosecution of that matter in the Guinean courts. It was in Switzerland and Paris that the issue was being decided. So that is just a tip of the iceberg. What is happening in Mozambique today, the insurgency, the radical militant movements, is based around a resource-rich region in that country. So you find that invariably conflicts and insurgency and disturbances are linked to resources. But who are behind fanning the embers of these conflicts are very difficult to explore and to find out, because they are operating from behind the shadows, in opaque environment. So here it is the duty of our scholars, intellectuals, intelligence officers, to really penetrate the haze and expose those who are controlling the puppets of our states, like puppet masters, is very important. Otherwise, whatever we do in Africa is like building on quicksand. There will be no foundation, there will be no solidity to our structures, to our institutions. And I agree fully with what Professor, the DG of NIA said, NIIA, in terms of the fragility of our state structures and the culture or perpetuation of continuity in governance. No matter who takes over government in Africa, there should be continuity and consolidation of the history of governance and the delivery of services to the people. Today in Africa, we practice democracy that is detached from the people. The majority of people today are not really positively impacted by the democratic culture. Democracy still is an alien institution to many of us. How many people in rural areas, the peasantry, can point to what is called democratic dividends? The pastoralists, the lumpen proletariat in the cities, the market women, the middle classes, everybody. So the idea of what Ambassador, my colleague, says about the euphoria with which coups are welcome in Africa testify to the detachment, alienation of the people from the democratic process. Political parties, one of their mandates or raison d'etre is to mobilize the populace. In which African countries have political parties successfully mobilized people to identify with the democratic cause, the democratic state, and instill patriotism and sense of unity and belonging? Look at the Nigerian scene today. What is the picture that appears to you when you look at the Nigerian democratic space today? Is elite conflict, elite struggle, elite discontent, elite rivalry, and so forth, translating and percolating into our psyche as if that is the established order. And here now, because of this conflict and rivalry, instability is engendered in our minds and in our culture. Suspicion of each other is growing, and with the more suspicion, the more discontentment and separation and division arises in the country. How can you build democracy in that sort of situation? So the external angle is very important. It's built around global power rivalry and control of Africa's resources. We have to be mindful of these things.
All right. Thank you very much, Ambassador Sarki. You've raised some important points, namely further interrogation of external influences in what is playing out in the unconstitutional change of governments in Africa. I want to bring in Professor Ewosa Osaga again into this aspect of the conversation. Namely, if ECOWAS as an international institution, the AU, are imposing sanctions on countries where we have seen on democratic change of governments. We have also seen a number of meetings by the heads of state and government of ECOWAS, and those meetings have consumed quite some resources. Are these institutions fully cognizant of the likely place of unseen hands from outside the region and outside the continent in manipulating what is playing out? If we take again the West African example, these have been mostly in Francophone countries. And an outsider might say, well, is France losing control, or is France seeking control again by indirect means? Prof.
I mean, I see that, you know, you are still very insistent on the West African peculiarity. Let me try to answer that peculiarity. The circumstances of West Africa are fairly well known. This is a sub-region that has a long history of military interventions and military rule. It's a place where we have had, you know, flashpoints of violence and you know, civil war and so on over the last 30 odd years. There are, you know, push and pull effects, you know, that would intersect to produce the kinds of trajectories and tendencies that appear to be peculiar to West Africa. But having said that, let me say, in terms of the frame of analysis and frame of interrogation, that there's a huge, huge deficit in all that we seem to be saying, dancing around it, but not being able to hit it on the head. You know, we've been very state-centric, you know, in our considerations of these democratic, you know, reversals. We've looked only at the state perspectives, you know, the perspectives of heads of states, of heads of governments, and state interests. We have neglected the non-state sector. And the non-state sector is what we need to engage, because everyone has talked about the seeming dichotomy between the government and the citizens, the deficits of democratic dividends and so on. This can only be engaged through a mainstreaming of the non-state sector in our overall engagements with democracy and democratic reversals. Now, ECOWAS and the AU, they have very specific frameworks within which they operate. And mind you, there are sanctions, there are responses to situations that seem to threaten the agreements, the protocols that govern these bodies. Take ECOWAS, for instance. ECOWAS has a 2001 amended supplemental protocol on good governance and democracy and so on. And this spells very clearly that the unconstitutional ascension to power actually is a misnomer, and therefore it is one to be responded to through condemnation, and that's what we have done. The AU has similar provisions. What people are saying, are these enough, to deal with these kinds of challenges? Now, at the last summit, of the ECOWAS Authority of Heads of State and Government, I think two significant things, were said. One, that the situation in Guinea-Bissau probably now warrants the deployment of a military force because there are all kinds of issues happening there, and it's important to listen to what the president, Mbalo, is saying. There are allegations that, the military situation in Guinea-Bissau, for instance, is tied very closely to the drug war that, extends to Colombia. And these are allegations. They may not be proven, but, they are there on the board. And therefore, how you want to use state resources, how you want to use state spaces to facilitate, the growing drug problem that has been identified as, a big issue in Guinea-Bissau. Or how the ECOWAS Authority of, Heads of State and Government has also decided to re-energize and reenact the ECOWAS mission in Gambia. This is a preemptive, measure that has been taken. I think that, on the whole, these regional and sub-regional organizations can only do what, the frameworks establishing them have allowed them to do. Now, the Peace and Security Council of the AU has been very upfront, with this. As you may know, when we had problems that seemed to portend some dire consequences in Zambia, the Peace and Security Committee Council was at the forefront of helping to resolve those issues. So we have those preemptive steps that can be taken. But once, interventions have taken place, the first lines of response would be what we have seen: condemn, impose sanctions, including travel restrictions, trade restrictions, and so on. Now, these ones, are within the protocol, the agreements, that these bodies function with. Now, to your direct question of whether ECOWAS and, say, the AU would know about these external influences, yes, there are hints about them, but these are matters for diplomatic engagement. These are not matters that, can be thrown open on the pages of newspapers and open to discussions and so on. But there are matters that can be engaged, behind the scene. And one knows that, we have the capabilities, we have the skills, we have the institutional framework within ECOWAS and the AU to engage, these kinds of externalities behind the scenes. But we cannot run away from those external forces. You have talked about the commonality that seems to tie Mali to Burkina Faso to Guinea, namely the fact that these are all Francophone countries. And, you know, France has been so much in charge in these places. The non-state sector response, as you would see in Mali, as you would see in Guinea, and even in Burkina Faso, seems to be saying, look, we have had enough, you know, of, you know, some kinds of external influences in our countries, and we now want, you know, new pathways. We now want to hold our governments accountable. We now want to be able to deal with issues that are internal to us using our own resources, using our own platforms, and using our own diplomacies that are internal to address these issues. I mean, for so long, we have externalized them. Let us emphasize the primacy of the internal negotiations, the primacy of the internal resolutions, the primacy of internal bargains, the primacy of internal understandings, the kinds of things that would hold and endure and then become sustainable. We understand the externalities, but we need to begin to think of how we can counteract them and reduce them so we can expand the space for local resolutions.
Thank you indeed. Kingsley, he has raised a very pertinent point here with respect to the cues around the Francophone countries, right? Because considering the fact that France has actually had a lot of influence on the countries they colonized in the past, and some of these military personnel will say, look, it is time for us to disengage. You know, let us look inward and see how we can take care of ourselves in terms of holding government accountable and what have you. Now, let me bring in Paul Ejime here again on the issue of the African Union and ECOWAS, who have also been criticized, you know, for not doing enough to forestall coups, you know, on the African continent. And Prof talked about the framework establishing these organizations. Should that be a way of rejigging these frameworks to probably expand it, to bring in some other, protocols that could lead to ensuring that these coups are forestalled before they take place?
Yeah, thank you, Kirian. Well, Prof has mentioned, touched on them, these instruments and legal texts that should govern, to which these people, all the heads of states have either signed or ratified, or, so it is binding on them. What is happening is that they have not been used to the optimal level, or they have been ignored. The supplementary protocol on democracy and good governance by ECOWAS, for instance, talks about the unconstitutional seizure of power, that is ascending or obtaining power by any other means other than constitutional means. But what has happened is that the concentration or the fixation is on military takeover. Meanwhile, there it has articles that talks about the fact that respect for the rule of law, articles on respect for the Constitution, articles on well-being of the citizens, and then that actually holds that should speak to the leadership, the president or prime minister. But they now, it is convenient for them now to look for, and this is not to justify military takeover, but the fact is that they are not applying that to themselves. AU also has a similar charter on democracy, election, and good governance, speaking about the same thing. It is not only when the military takes power that those articles should be activated. And on top of that, there is also what you call the early warning system, which I know that ECOWAS has. These are things that will alert you. Your antenna should be there. When issues are brewing, you don't wait until the horse has bolted out of the stable before you start chasing. So those early warning, I know, is there to warn people, warn ECOWAS or AU, that listen, here somebody has triggered fire that can burn the whole house. But this organization, because of their composition, you mentioned France. When you know, the heads of leadership of AU were being selected, leadership of ECOWAS, leadership of the UN office in West Africa, and then the UN mission in Mali were being constituted. Some of us raised the issue that they were tilting towards a particular power bloc. And that is what we are seeing today. Giving France the unmitigated power, overbearing influence. They control those who are there at the AU, at ECOWAS, at the UN office in West Africa, and then MINUSMA. Check all those that are occupying those positions today. They have one or two things to do about France. And it's very easy. And then France has a veto, belongs to the UN Security Council. Uses its powers there to go also bring these countries in line, to bring them to follow its own dictates. France has military bases in most of these countries. It controls the economy of this through the CFA franc monetary zone currency. So it is very easy. But my postulation will be that we have been independent for more than 60 years. We cannot continue to blame the colonial powers. It is a rat at home that will invite the one outside or tell them that this is where you have food. So what we are saying is that African leaders, they should extricate that umbilical cord that is tying them to colonial powers. Let them govern like Africans. They are not governing like Africans. And that is the issue. They are, you know, one is their own interests and the interests of, they appear to be, somebody mentioned puppetry here. Somebody is holding, you know, just using that to control what is happening in Africa. With all our resources, they are still exploiting the resources and you know, with the connivance of the so-called leaders who are rulers.
Should there be African model of democracy?
Okay, I will say democracy is favored because of what what it has, about the fact that it gives you periodic elections and then the possibility of changing leaders when they don't perform. But Kieran, the issue is not about name. Well, okay, remove the name, call it anything. What the people want is good governance. Whether you call it democracy or Africacy or West Africacy, whatever you want to call it. But the fact is that democracy is not even being practiced. It is just the practitioners are the problem, not the name, not the system. Okay, just like you can have a constitution, wonderful constitution, but if those who are going to apply it are not attuned to it, they do not have democratic principle, DNA in them, it will not work. But also let's say that democracy is not a destination. It is a process. Just like elections, people should not mistake or equate elections to democracy. And that is where Paul, some of the problems we have.
Paul, Jim, thank you very much for the points that you have raised. We're going to have to take a short break. But just before we do, you talked about early warning systems and response to brewing issues. I think we must also acknowledge the fact, and President Muhammadu Buhari played a role in this, when Yahya Jammeh was fomenting trouble in the Gambia. ECOWAS, of course, moved in and stabilized the polity, as it were, for the circumstance that ECOWAS found itself and the Gambia needed to be stabilized.
Because Jammeh is a listening person. Like, he didn't want to take a hard stance. Or otherwise, in some countries, he could have taken a hard stance. To say, look, I am not moving.
No, well, that's fine. That's fine. But the success of ECOWAS in getting him out of the way and stabilizing the polity is one to be acknowledged.
Exactly.
All right, you're watching Good Morning Nigeria live on NTA's network service. We'll take a short break now.
The ever-busy ancient city of Onitsha is a commercial hub with millions of commuters seamlessly linking other states daily for business, leisure, and other purposes. To upscale its road network, the construction of a 1.6-kilometer long second Niger bridge, including a 10.3-kilometer highway furnished with other infrastructure, has been in motion by the federal government. This project will ease congestion on the existing 56-year-old Onitsha bridge and boost the economic capacity of the state as it easily connects to other parts of the country. The completion of the world-class second Niger Bridge Onitsha will be one of the many proud moments of the state, its people, Nigerians, and foreign investors. Onitsha, which hosts the largest market in Africa, is geared up to boast of an impressive road network. Once again, these moments are made alive by the federal government, and it is deserving of all the applause.
Dialogue, empathy, love and unity. These are vital components of nation building.
For all to be well, we appeal that we should refrain from volatile, provocative, inciting messages and language.
Let's build and not destroy.
We've been trying our best to contain the situation. And in our operations, we've been able to make a lot of recoveries. We've been able to also arrest suspects that are involved in this kind of activities. And we've been able to also recover, particularly arms and ammunition from those who are carrying it unlawfully and disturbing the peace of the people. But generally, our morale in the Nigerian police is always guided by our commitment to do what we have sworn to do. Peace and security must be looked into as a priority by all. To look at security as the business of all of us.
This message is from the Federal Ministry of Information and Culture.
We are all Nigerians. Against all odds, we shall and must remain united. We may have our challenges, our problems, and setbacks. However, together we shall overcome them all. What doesn't break us shall make us stronger. This is the mindset that shall bring peace, progress, and prosperity to our beloved country. Do not let tribal and religious sentiments govern how you think, act, or feel. Don't be influenced by those who want to destroy our precious national unity. Everybody who's a Nigerian is your brother and your sister. This is the mindset of the new Nigeria. It is also the mindset that we must all adopt. Let us support each other in creating the Nigeria of our dreams. This message is from the Nigerian Television Authority, NTA.
The center is purposely established in order to provide these services that are examinations, medical examinations, and investigations that were not provided for in Kano as well as the entire Northwest region. It's equipped with modern technological equipment in terms of radiological services. We have MRI 1.5 Tesla. We have digital X-ray as well as 4D ultrasound equipment. The importance of the center cannot be overemphasized. Just within 1 year, the center attended to thousands and numerous patients as well as medical examinations. NKDC is established in order also to provide these healthcare facilities as a discounted price.
This message is from the Federal Ministry of Information and Culture.
All right, you're welcome back, and it's still Good Morning Nigeria on NTA's network service. Let's go back to Ambassador Nkoyotoyo. Ambassador Nkoyotoyo, let's take a look at the responses by ECOWAS and the AU. Yes, Professor Ewosa Asare says the institutions, that's to say ECOWAS and AU, have responded within the frameworks that they have established. I'm also wondering whether we couldn't, as he also said, explore further diplomatic angles to ensure the efficacy of what sanctions they have imposed. We are seeing the diplomatic issues around Ukraine and Russia and the threats by the West, the UK and the US, to impose sanctions. Iran is still under sanctions by the US. Is it possible to canvass international support to say, look, yeah, this is what we want to stabilize our region. We don't want it to be a hotbed. Can we canvass outside support for the kind of sanctions that should be imposed on these undemocratic governments in Africa?
Thank you. I don't think that's very far away or very far removed from the framework itself. I think it's something that is within the profile or the ambit of the framework itself. This is about dealing with systems which have broken down. And over the years, I think we've seen, even in terms of where we have involved the military in trying to resolve some of those conflicts on the continent, that we haven't been without help from external sources. The European Union being one of the main blocs that has been courted in this respect. But you must come back to the whole question of the attempt at the very same countries to say, look, this is within the ambit of our sovereign rights. You know, we don't want people coming from outside to tell us what it is. One of the lessons I learned from being at the African Union is that it was a club of people, of heads of states, who said, we see no evil, we hear no evil, and we speak no evil. That's the culture. It's the culture of the African Union. It's the culture largely of ECOWAS itself. And like we have said in the discussions that have happened here, it's only when there is a breakdown that you begin to see some sort of attempt at blaming and at finding reasons to get involved. But before the breakdown, people often do not get involved at all. And that's where I think what Paul talks about, the early warning signs and what we can do with the early warning signs becomes an important part of it. Gone are the days when Nigeria used to play a very strong role in terms of moving in, like we saw in Sierra Leone and Liberia and things, and moving to try to stabilize countries that were at the brink of being breaking down entirely, where the governments and the state actors were not able to hold the government together. And I just wanted to add that in terms of what we need to see from external and international blocs, like the European Union, the bigger blocs, the UN and groups like that, there are consistent engagements that happen at the level of the Peace and Security Council and happens here in the ECOWAS level, which are explorable. The extent to which those pressures, this is all about putting pressure on the country. It's not about getting involved. It's about putting pressure on those countries to reverse their positions and return to democratic rule. And I think this is something that can be done. But let me just add that the things have changed pretty much over the last couple of years, because we're now beginning to see, like I think the point which Professor Osage raised around non-state actors beginning to become a major part of what is actually making the countries ungovernable, and therefore throwing up new challenges and making for this whole question of the re-insurgence of non-democratic rule something that the people and the citizens themselves are yearning for, an important part of the conversation. How do you even begin to bring that and factor that into the pressures that you are building? Traditionally, you have sanctions, you suspend the country from being a member of ECOWAS or the African Union, you then do travel bans, you do things like economic blockades and things like that. These also tend to complicate, because the citizens are already complaining on the ground that, listen, we have a problem here. Our democracy is not delivering on good governance. We are not seeing development. We are not seeing countries that work for us. We are not seeing the democracies that deliver on the dividends of democracy, like we used to call them. And then you turn around and see a situation where you're now bringing sanctions and all sorts of things into that same condition and complexifying the situation on the ground. So I believe that, yes, while we can look for external support for what our frameworks allow us to do, we can also begin to ask ourselves, is there something else that we could do other than what we have within that ambit of the framework. And I think this is where we need to go and begin to ask ourselves, what is it within the African context that we can really address? And I think the point you make about the Gambia and the way in which we intervened very early, that the early interventions and the way we used our own local or what I call regional pressure building mechanisms is something we need to look for. But in all of this, the first point I made about leaders who speak no evil is a very big one. These are a club of people who see themselves as people who need to be protected in those positions that they hold. And oftentimes the questions of accountability and the failure to deal with the issues that the citizens themselves are asking for. But I think the last point I would like to make is that there is an important distinction as to why are we seeing these coups in West Africa and not seeing it in East Africa or Southern Africa. And these are all countries that came out of the same birthing process, the same fragility, as you would say, the same weaknesses that you say, and the same conditions of colonization and post-colonizing states. So it's an interesting point. And why is it mostly French? It's another very interesting point. But I think also the role of the Sahel is one thing that we haven't brought into all this configuration. Huge ungovernable spaces, not governed by state actors, but governed by non-state actors. And these non-state actors are redefining the nature of the state and ensuring that statehood becomes a question of contestation.
All right. Thank you, Madam. Let's return to Ambassador Dauda Danladi, the former Nigerian High Commissioner to Pakistan. Earlier on, you came from the historical point of view, raising some very, interesting, points there. But now the conversation has really gone into the nitty-gritty of the topic this morning, and we are looking at the protocols and frameworks, establishing the operations of AU and, of course, ECOWAS as a sub-regional body. Now, are you satisfied with these frameworks and the sanctions that usually come hard on any country that has undemocratically changed government? Are those sanctions efficacious? Because it does appear that the countries knew quite well that, look, if we strike, for instance, there should be sanctions, and these sanctions are not really, deterring them from, plotting more coups in the countries concerned. So what would be your own take with respect to the responsibility of the bodies, in Africa that should provide some level of protection for nations that belong to them? Okay. Ambassador Dauda Danladi, did you get my question? Connection, his audio connection.
All right, Kieran.
I think we should return to Abuja presently and perhaps wait to see if the engineers can get us reconnected to him for further analysis. There was this question that I raised earlier on that has to do with, if there should be an African model of democracy, should we look inwards, actually, to see how we can develop an intuitive concept that will be peculiar to Africa, perhaps for us to also take cognizance of the fact that we have a culture, tradition, and what have you. Ambassador can come in there.
Thank you, Kirian. I think, the DGNIA professor has already noted to refer to the idea that democracy is not a potted plant that you can just pick from one place and plant it everywhere and for it to grow. It has to have a conducive soil, conducive environment in which to grow. And that environment is the culture, the history, the collective idiosyncrasies and identities of the people. If you don't have a collectivity of these factors coming together to grow and nourish democracy, it will always fail and falter along the road. In the 1980s, Nigerian intellectuals, homegrown patriotic intellectuals, highly educated, who proposed that the way we are going with our democracy is still something that is alien to our history and culture. Let us fashion our own system of democracy And one of the first to write about this and articulate his views was the late Professor Claude Ake. I don't know how many politicians, how many intellectuals know about Professor Claude Ake today. Beyond Professor Claude Ake, Dr. Yusuf Bala Usman, in his book, For the Liberation of Nigeria, has clearly enunciated indigenous methodologies and actions that we could take first to address the liberation of our economy from Western imperialist control. Secondly, how to reorganize the Nigerian state to become patriotic, independent, and in charge of our country, to deliver respect and dignity to the Nigerian people. And thirdly, the collective reorganization of the political space in this country in order for it to be accountable, inclusive, patriotic, and to actually deliver dividends for the people. Intellectuals have looked into that. If you open those books, and Dr. Shogun Oshoba and Bala Usman, in their minority report during the Constitutional Conference, they suggested that the 1999 Constitution, as it was at that time, would lead to problems if they were not configured around clusters of actions, around labor, around the peasant question, around urbanization, around population growth, around control of the economy, and so forth. So if we fail to address these issues, we would not stabilize our democracy. And I think in the rest of Africa and in Nigeria, the issue of homegrown democracy is very important. And I remember reading a book written by Henry Kissinger a long time ago about how incongruous Western democracy will be and was in Africa. And he was right, that we are essentially people organized around traditional cultures, institutions, and tribal organizations. That it will be difficult for us to rise above that if we are not collectively brought together the different hodgepodge of communities to identify with a national goal. And the failure of the elite in Africa is to mobilize and unify, consolidate and solidify Africans towards particular goal. And that is what is missing today. So we need to go back to the writings of Bala Usman, Claude Ake, Shogun Oshoba, and all those high intellectuals of high repute in order to get our bearing right. It's not about talking about elite consensus today on elections, on party organization, party machinery, internal party democracy, and so forth that will lead us there. There are fundamental questions of what is the laboring class doing? What is the peasant class doing? What are the urban proletariat doing? How are they accommodated and how are they involved?
All right, Ambassador Usman Sarki, sorry, we have to interject at this stage. It's a conversation that obviously will continue until there are clear pathways for the restoration of constitutional governments. The point about an African model of democracy is interesting. We have had conversations around it also on Good Morning Nigeria. Something perhaps not previously considered, the so-called Kabiyesi syndrome in our culture that is also responsible for the sit-tight syndrome that we have seen on the continent. Ambassadors and Professor, we would like to thank you very much. Just to indicate, Kirian, that in the past, say in Nigeria, people used to troop out in jubilation when there was when you had coups. We have also seen that now in the coups in different parts of Africa.
In Burkina Faso, it was like a holiday, you know.
Precisely, but the time came in Nigeria where we said no more. And that's where we are today, going on now to nearly 23 years of democratic governance. Professor Egosa Osaga, Director General of the Nigerian Institute for International Affairs, Victoria Land, Lagos, deep thanks for your insights into our conversation this morning. We also would like to appreciate Ambassador Danladi. He's Nigeria's former ambassador or high commissioner to Pakistan. Dauda Danladi, thank you very much for being our guest this morning. Another ambassador, of course, is Nkoyo Tuyo, also a former member of the House of Representatives. He was Nigeria's envoy to Ethiopia, or Addis Ababa, as is often said. Paul Ejime, international affairs analyst with critical focus on West Africa. We appreciate your being around. And Ambassador Usman Sarki, currently directing staff at NIPS, that is the Institute for Policy and Strategic Studies at Kuru, near Jos. We thank you. He's also a former Deputy Permanent Rep to the United Nations. So that's it for our conversation segment. Let's take, of course, one of our segments before we close.
Well, and that's
right.
a good one, Nigeria, for today. We thank you for watching. We'll return again tomorrow for a fresh edition of the program. My name is Kirian Umayo. We'll see you again tomorrow.
All right, and I'm Kingsley Osadolo. I join my colleague in appreciating your being with us on the program today.